In a truly blended spirit, we're mixing it up a little this afternoon. We've got Grant here, beaming in from San Diego. We've got Christine, who's going to share a story from Australia. Christine's from Australia. She's in the room sharing her story. And then we've got Dean Shareski beaming in from Montreal. So a pleasure and a privilege to have you in the room. We're live streaming out and let the fun learning conversations begin. Kia ora and welcome, Grant.
The sound coming back to me is not great, but I think you said kia ora, and so kia ora to everybody there. It was a couple years ago I was with you there in person, and now I'm not. So we're trying out this new modality, and I understand, Anne, that you're also live streaming this. Is that correct? Kia ora, there's a Twitter hashtag down at the bottom, and the good folks at CORE asked me to share with you some things about my new book that just came out called Moving the Rock. And I want to mention before I forget that in the acknowledgments of the book, there's a little mini section that acknowledges contributions of New Zealand educators who have helped inform my thinking over the last several years as I wrote this book. So without, I'm going to start my clock here, and I've never done this talk in 18 minutes before, but I'm going to try to stay on time. Hold on a second. Right. So I think that education is facing three big existential questions right now. Why should we change? What's that change going to look like? And how will we get there? And that's kind of how I want to kick this off and how I want to frame this short talk. To be honest, the question of why we should change, I think that train has already left the station. And here in the United States, and I think to some extent, it's probably happening in New Zealand, I think we've reached a tipping point that many of us know why we want to change education. It's not about the jobs that are awaiting our students in the future. There are a lot of other reasons. We as educators know what great learning looks like. Our students know what a great learning experience is. Their parents do. And so we should be past this conversation of why we should change. We should change schools because we know what great learning looks like, and we know how to do a better, we know what a better system is than the one that we've had for the last 100 years or so. So I hope that we start moving past the point of keep going back and having the same conversation over and over again of why education should change. And in fact, the what question, that train is kind of pulling out of the station already as well. I've been able to visit with many, many dozens of schools and thousands of educators. I've certainly visited with some of your great educators in New Zealand, and we keep coming back to the same answers, that we want schools that are richer and deeper in learning, and that are not based on sort of test preparation and that sort of thing. At a really high level, it comes down to kind of this. We're shifting right now from organizations and schools that have been based on teaching to become organizations based on learning. And if your school hasn't had that conversation, it's a really good place to start the conversation. What does it mean to be an organization or a school that's highly focused on learning as opposed to the transfer or the transmission of information? I was working a little bit on your keynote this morning, and I know that message really came about, this business that transferring knowledge for decades, and we really have to focus more on learning. And when schools do get into that conversation, we generally end up sort of agreeing that there's this thing we can now call deeper learning, an experience of learning that's focused more on student engagement, curiosity, and student ownership of the process, rather than on here's an amount of content that you need to learn and then regurgitate that on a test. There's a lot more resources about deeper learning if you just Google deeper learning and the deeper learning network. So a lot of us have gotten to this point. Not everybody, but we find that many, many community stakeholders, when allowed to express what they really think good learning looks like, come up with characteristics of an education that sound more like a deeper learning modality than a traditional industrial age model. And so that really gets us to the how, and that's what I want to just share a little bit about with you today, because that's what I focused on for this new book. I think a lot of us have been frustrated that The schools haven't changed a lot for decades. And I got this image in my mind of this big rock with a tremendous amount of inertia. It's very hard to move. It's very hard to make changes in this system. And our systems of education in the States are vastly bigger than yours are even, and it's still very, very hard. And I asked myself a couple of years ago, why is that? And I think it really turns out that inertia is caused by these contrarian forces that keep pushing our school system back and forth. And for us here in the States, those forces include the political left and right who have their own agendas, the people who think that teachers' unions are wonderful, and the people who think that teachers' unions are horrible, the people who think we should have more standards and more testing, and that we have too many standards and too much testing, and the government state houses, et cetera. And so I asked the question to write this book. I said, how are schools around our country, at least, transforming in ways that don't require permission from the forces that have kept us stuck in the past? So rather than pointing fingers and blaming and continuing the blame game, I asked, are there examples of schools that are just moving forward in wonderfully brilliant ways and transforming to a deeper learning environment without having asked permission or received permission from these contrarian forces? And what I found was the answer very much was yes. And that's really forms the basis of the book. And so I can't obviously go into all of that in a great deal of depth today, but essentially I found a handful of what I ended up calling levers, because I was using this metaphor of this big, huge, stuck rock. And how do you lever that? Well, you have to apply forces that are greater than the forces of inertia in the first place. And so here are a few of them, and they each sort of comprise a chapter of the book. For example, we find great examples of schools and districts that hold community conversations in different ways. Some of them show the movie Most Likely to Succeed, or they have a series of coffees where they allow teachers and parents and students to come together and just talk about what really great learning looks like and has looked like in their life. And then they create pilots, either within one school or at a school, create a school that demonstrates to their community that this is what the future of learning can look like. And what we find is that there are a lot of families, a lot of kids, and a lot of parents, once they experience that, they come back and they say, wait a second, that's what I want. That's what I want for my student, and that's what I want for my family. And so let's move forward on that. And so it starts to create a community demand for this. We see this across demographics and across both public and private schools here in the States. And it's about getting that conversation, kind of getting the ball rolling. And so that was a powerful lever. Another one was, and I could have written an entire book and not even scratched the surface of schools that have really started to break this boundary, this artificial boundary between school and world. That school is the place we come to learn, and then world is where we live our lives. And I've found so many schools in an amazing array of different ways, learning in and with their community. It's one thing all schools have. Every school has a community, whether it's rural or urban or mixed, whether it's high socioeconomic status or underserved communities. And there are incredible learning opportunities with partners in these that allow us to go out into the community, have our students and teachers learn very authentically in the community. One of the examples that I highlight in the book is a group called Remake Learning. You can Google that. It's a consortium in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the whole city really has gotten behind this. And there are literally thousands of individuals and hundreds of companies and organizations that partner with students and teachers on a very rich and authentic basis. So to kind of smear that boundary between school and world. Very, very powerful, and something that every school and district can do. And it doesn't require, at least in our country, it doesn't require the government to tell you it's okay to do this. And so there are others. One of them has to do with making connections amongst individuals. We're making a connection right here that really wasn't possible a couple of years ago. 35 minutes ago, I got off an event like this, where we had a video collaboration with 36 educators, most of whom had never met each other, from around the United States, meeting up for an hour. It didn't cost anybody anything. And we were essentially having the equivalent of a Twitter chatter and ed camp, with much deeper, richer conversations. We had a similar one a couple nights ago. Well, for me, it was a night. For you guys, it was the afternoon with the Ed Chat New Zealand group. And we had 16 or 18 people on, again, sharing experiences, making connections. Nobody received permission to do that from a principal or a superintendent. It was convenient. People could do it from their own couch at home. Even one gentleman was, I think, having a pint while we were talking. So very, very accessible and easy way for us to all make connections and share what's working and what's not working as we try to transform our schools. And another way is just starting to change how we train teachers. We're starting to see that in the States. We're starting to see our colleges of education realize that we can't keep training teachers for a modality of learning that is out of date. We need to teach them how our students need to learn in the future. And so we're starting to change curriculum in these colleges. Are all these happening right now? Yes, we're seeing examples. Are they happening as robustly as we'd like? No, some of them are just in their incipient stages. But as we look to the future, we can see very much that I think we've now passed the tipping point. Now we're really focused not on why should we change, what's the change going to look like, but we're focused very much more on the how. And so in looking at that future, it's another element that's in the book that I think is really extraordinary, and I want to share with you because I think I think maybe for some folks it's the most important takeaway of the book. And that is, I was able to talk with a lot of folks, educators, parents, thought leaders from at least around our country, and ask them, what do you think is inevitable about the future of education? Things that we don't really have control over that are going to happen over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so I go into that a fair bit in the book. The relationship between teachers and students. Students are not going to move through our classrooms based on their biological age. They're going to move through, they're going to do their work, they're going to be assessed on their interest, their passion, their performance, their demonstration of competency, not the number of hours they sit in a seat. Teachers are going to be viewed as coaches, mentors, facilitators, tutors, all sorts of different words to use to describe that relationship that they build with the students in the classroom. Our assessment strategies are going to change. There's a move afoot here in the United States to completely rebuild the high school transcripts so that we send our students to apply for admissions at college, not based on their standardized scores alone, but on a much broader spectrum of cognitive and non-cognitive performance measurements. Technology, of course, is radically changing, and some of the most important changes that are going to take place, where billions of dollars are being invested now, are in things like virtual reality and artificial intelligence, which for the first time will allow relation-rich learning, not transaction-rich learning, but relation-rich learning to take place regardless of the boundaries of a classroom or a campus or this amount of time that you have with a certain group of people. What we're doing here right now, your students and I could be learning from each other in a relation-rich way going forward. And of course, we're shifting our ideas about the use of time and space. This idea that schools of the future are going to be a place where only our young people go for a certain number of hours a day, a certain number of days a week, a certain number of days a year. That's going to dissolve. We're going to be going to school for our entire lives to get what we need to learn when we need it, from wherever we need it around the world in a really global sense. And it's not just about technology, it's about a lot of this social relationship. And so I want to share just three kind of big ideas about that are fundamentally changing the whole human interaction and how it impacts education. The first is one that I shared with you all when I was down there 2 years ago. The term I coined a number of years ago was the cognitosphere. Others talk about the metaverse or the neurosphere, or just a state of flow. We're in the incipient development of fundamentally different type of human social relationship based on a global social neural network that includes everybody in the world that has connection to the internet. And so we're able to create and exchange and archive and share knowledge not through the portal of one school, but through this very democratic and open and accessible network that is exploding in its complexity and in its ease of use. Schools, the education systems are going to be powerful if they empower things like creativity and sharing rather than the commoditized transaction of knowledge. And this is not ever going to turn around and go back the other way. A second one was really raised in Tom Friedman's new book called Thank You for Being Late, in a conversation he had with Eric Teller, the CEO of Google X, part of the Google system, where he very demonstrates this relationship that I think we're all sort of fundamentally understanding, that the rate of change in terms of things like technology and global markets and the media and things like that, the rate of change is this exponential curve that is increasingly steep every moment of our lives. And yet there's this other cross curve that's the rate at which humans are able to adapt to change. And what Teller says is that we as individuals and organizations, we are now at a point on that rate of change that has exceeded our ability to adapt to change itself. In the past, change has taken place over years or even decades, centuries, millennia, and now these changes are happening months and years, and that our ability to cope with that really has exceeded the rate of change, has exceeded our ability to cope with that. And we as educators have the responsibility of somehow figuring out what that means in terms of the growth of our students and their lives that they spend with us. And finally, when we look at schools themselves out 20 or 25 years, we're pretty convinced that all schools are going to fall into one of three categories. They're going to be this around the world. They're going to be schools that are so well insulated by some combination of their demographics, their market position, the community that they serve, maybe their legacy, their reputation, that the world can change around them and they really can do whatever they want. They don't have to change. They can continue to deliver the same old, really sort of tired and worn out system of education. And they can continue to do that because there's such a demand for them, in some cases private schools, but even in some cases public schools. The vast majority of schools don't fall into that category, though. The second category are schools that really do differentiate themselves, and they demonstrate, at least here in the States, we have an exploding number of choices of our families to choose from for where they're going to send their kids to school. And so for a school to be the one where their family says, yeah, I want my student to go to that school, be it public or private, they have to really differentiate themselves from all the other choices. And then there's the schools that are going to struggle and fail because our students are going to have so many other ways of getting an education that if you're not in that privileged group and you haven't differentiated yourself, then you're unfortunately going to be struggling or failing. And we don't want any of us to fall into that bottom category. And so really the middle category is the one that educators should be focusing on now. And so this is kind of the takeaway graphic is that the schools of the future over the next 10, 20 years are going to be dramatically different than they are today. This same exponential curve that you saw in the last diagram applies here. Most schools today look a lot like they did in the past. Schools in the future are going to look radically different. And you as an educator in your community need to be in this mix of this conversation. You need to be on this trajectory somewhere now, because the longer you wait to get on this trajectory, the harder it is to actually transform your school and have it be relevant 10 or 15 years into the future. And so finally, I think the big takeaways from that I hope from this new book are these. The first is this really great news. Everywhere I looked around the States, and I know that this is happening in New Zealand because I'm in good contact with so many of your great folks down there. This is already happening. Many of these levers that I describe in the book are already being pressed and in really authentic ways. And all you need to do is connect with folks who are already doing that and learn from them and share with each other. Some of this is low-hanging fruit. You can just go out and do it tomorrow. It doesn't need permission from a lot of people. We just have to say, take this on and do it. And so the challenge therefore is that we can't blame anybody else now. We can't blame the other. At least here we can in the States. We can't say it's the fault of the government, or it's the fault of the political left or right, or it's the fault of whoever's in the state house right now. This is on us. This is our responsibility. We know what great learning looks like. We know what we want it to be, and we can start moving forward, not on all points, but on many points. And what I try to do in the book is share a lot of very, very tactical and tangible ways that you as teachers, administrators, parents, students, and other community stakeholders can help to move this rock and not let it be sitting there stuck another 10 years down the road. So those are kind of the highlights of the new book. I appreciate you spending some time with me, and I'm going to shut up and I think listen to your other speakers, and if there are any questions, I can answer them later on.
Great. Kia ora. Hello. My name's Chris Trimnell. I've travelled across from Victoria to join the uLearn conference this week. It's lovely to have the opportunity to connect live, but also virtually to many more educators. And thank you, Anne, for the invite. My topic today is Global Projects, 21st Century Learning in a Digital World. Okay, I've decided I can't talk about global projects until I firstly mention the more encompassing term global education. So what is global education and why does it matter? Today, the world seems a smaller place than ever before, what with enhanced travel, ties across the globe with business and politics, global migration, etc. With better communication systems also comes more awareness of world issues like climate change, nuclear war threats, refugee problems, world health epidemics, mass starvation, shootings, nuclear disasters, etc. Sadly, this awareness of world issues is all negative, but there are some positives too, like organisations helping mankind, politicians working together for mutual benefit, or so they tell us, etc. But of course, as you know, the media does tend to dwell on the most sensational and often the most offensive things happening in the world, rather than tell us about the happy good luck stories. The bottom line, though, is that no one can afford to put one's head in the sand and pretend these things are not happening, nor should students be denied the use of digital tools that help keep them informed and assist their understanding. That's one reason why I find it so frustrating that many schools still ban YouTube. Isn't it better to teach the kids the strategies for searching and the steps to follow if something inappropriate surfaces, rather than simply ban the resource? This, to me, is part of global education. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we only use YouTube, but the idea is there to expand students' vision of the world around them and give them some strategies for handling new ideas, encourage creative thought for possible solutions. Now, I'm not going to bore you with figures relating to how many times kids will change jobs in the length of their working life, but it is odds on that jobs will require people to adopt expanded horizons. This might mean sitting at home, communicating via the internet to people and companies around the world, or it might mean physically traversing the globe and coming face to face with people of many different cultures and backgrounds. Even Peter Lord's 40-year-old morph now appears not only on screens around the world, but was recently spotted at this international airport. Now, my eldest son, who's 40, didn't know who Morph was, so I'm hoping there are some people in the audience who will know he's the pre-runner to Wallace and Gromit, Shaun the Sheep, that fame. Education is always evolving, as anyone who's been teaching from between 1 and 40 years will know only too well. The basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic will always need to be taught, but as society changes, new skills are identified and need to be addressed. Pedagogy likewise needs to keep up with changes to ensure student learning is always optimised. The majority of people would agree that the future of the world is dependent on each successive generation, so we must ensure that students get the education now to stand them in good stead for the world as a whole to prosper. I found the chart created by p21.org, which is Partnership for 21st Century Learning, particularly good at pulling together everything that teachers in schools need to be addressing today. regardless of their country. Now, I'm not quite sure how clear that is, so I'll just outline briefly. In the green area is the core curriculum subjects, just mentioned, as well as 21st century themes like global awareness and citizenship. The purple area looks at digital skills, being able to make sense of information and media. The red area, titled Life and Career Skills, includes things like responsibility, initiative, social and cross-cultural skills, as well as accountability and productivity. The yellow area that I'm particularly interested in is also known as the 4 Cs, or in other documents by other organisations, the 5 Cs, the 6 Cs, or even the 7 Cs. And it includes skills like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity. Underpinning all of this in that diagram are the grey lines, the areas of teacher responsibility, curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and the learning environment itself. Wow, that's a lot of responsibilities on teachers, and the demands seem to be ever increasing, as you would know. So, what's the answer? Is there in fact an answer? It would be naive to expect just one solution, but I would like to propose a very legitimate way of addressing a large number of the above components at the same time, and that is through participating in well-designed global projects. Or if you have the time and inclination, designing and implementing your own. So that's what my focus is. As an ICT specialist in Victorian schools, I've participated in a number of global projects over the last few years with my students from year 1 to year 6. But if you're secondary in the audience or listening to this talk, it's equally applicable to secondary and tertiary as well. All the projects that I've been involved with have been engaging for both the students and myself. They've strengthened kids' skills using Web 2 tools and programs, improved their communication abilities, helped them work as team members, and developed empathy for different cultures. It was great seeing my Year 6 students get excited when they were posting through Edmodo and discovering that lots of students in Indonesia also liked the very same music and bands as they did. Perhaps not so earth-shattering for me personally was the fact that people all over the world eat hamburgers. The message being we are more alike than different. So already, hopefully, you're starting to realise that the 4 or 5 C words, communication, collaboration, creativity, citizenship, critical thinking, can all be addressed through global projects. But not addressed in a boring standalone skills type lesson, but through real-world, authentic learning situations. These situations present opportunities where students across schools, cities, countries, develop a rapport with others, discuss ideas, address world issues, think laterally, reflect and work together to create multimedia artefacts that demonstrate their learning and their own possible solutions to various issues and scenarios. Now, the reality. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any data available as yet on the number of students, teachers, schools per country regularly participating in global projects, but I could hazard a guess that it might be as low as 3%. It could go up maybe as high as 5% in Northern Hemisphere schools, and it could drop to only 1% in Southern Hemisphere schools. So, my question, if global projects are so good, why aren't more schools participating? Sadly, my personal belief is that a lot of teachers still perceive global projects as something that would be nice to do, but they just don't have the time. I certainly acknowledge that teachers are extra busy nowadays, teaching everything that is required, as well as the pre-test, the post-test, Data is the buzzword, along with accountability. This is where I believe another C word needs to be clearly addressed in global projects. This word being curriculum, nothing new to teachers. Teachers need to be able to see clearly the curriculum objectives they can satisfy by participating in different types of global projects. This is my crusade, another C word, trying to convince classroom teachers, C words everywhere now, to not see global projects as an optional extra, but to view them as a very smart way of addressing curriculum objectives, and objectives that cut across a range of subjects. A considerable number of teachers who currently participate in global projects only see their students once a week. It's still possible to participate at this level, but so much more can be achieved if your students are involved more often. Integrating your curriculum will allow you to spend more than one lesson a week on a global project. So it's really classroom teachers that I'm trying to reach out to. It doesn't matter what country you are working in, there are common elements across all curriculums. Let's take English as an example. In the Australian National Curriculum, English is divided into 3 strands: language, literature and literacy, with numerous further breakdowns. In your New Zealand curriculum, English is divided into 2 sections: listening, reading, viewing, and speaking, writing, presenting. Different terminology, but both curriculums refer to a very similar development of skills and attitudes. As you know, you can't teach any component of English in a vacuum. It has to be tied to a topic, an idea, some form of information, etc. So why not participate in a global project to address those objectives? Okay, now this is not pie in the sky talk. Let's look at a concrete example. I ran a global project last year called Poetry with Passion and Performance across 3 schools in Victoria and 2 in the US. Kids were put into mixed teams. Their poetry writing was scaffolded in such a way as to ensure their success. And one of the best things I witnessed was a conversation between 2 students in Edmodo where one was saying, "I don't usually like poetry, but this is great." And to me, that said it all. Kids were immersed in the 6 C's: communicating, collaborating, creative and critically thinking, citizenship and curriculum, English curriculum objectives. If we had New Zealand schools participating, all your core competencies would also have been covered. But let's not stop at just English objectives. I'm currently managing some global projects for Julie Lindsay of Flat Connections Global Project fame, and I believe she was a spotlight speaker here last year. Earlier this year, we co-designed a project called Endangered Animals. Its overriding theme is, can we help save the endangered animals of the world? The aim of this project was to encourage Australian teachers to trial a global project and for them to realise just how many curriculum objectives could be addressed by doing so. In the end, I identified 7 pages of objectives across 6 subject areas, but the main focus was on science, specifically biological understandings. It was great at a recent online teachers meeting with this project to hear how one teacher had a light bulb moment. She was stressing out as she felt she didn't have enough time to run the global project just within her allotted science lesson time, but then realised a lot of the work the students were doing was covering her English needs too. So then she felt a lot more comfortable devoting more time per week, and her students got so much more out of the project. Yay, someone has seen the light. Excuse me. This collage was sent in by another teacher involved in the Endangered Animals project and shows the students in action using a variety of tools and addressing all the C words, including curriculum. So we've got virtual handshakes using Flipgrid to start communications and build empathy. Padlets were used to collaboratively gather the research, and they were practising citizenship as they were responding to each other's efforts and ideas. VoiceThread was used to co-create a multimedia artefact, showcasing their learning and for reflection by students on possible solutions. Now, I've noted in your New Zealand curriculum, the Endangered Animals project would have integrated perfectly, again with your 5 core competencies, as well as addressing many objectives in living worlds, which, as you know, is a component of your science curriculum. A second Endangered Animals project starts next week, This project proved very popular, and we have already achieved our aim of bringing in some more Australian schools. So now our percentage of participation might have risen to 1.25%. So there is still a long way to go. If anyone's interested here, we're going to be running the Endangered Animals Project again next year. So you just go to the Flat Connections website for details. While there, check out other projects. As I said before, they run from K to Year 12, or you can email me direct. In summary, let's go full circle. Let's return to global education and why global competence matters so much. Asia Society, in their publication, Education for Global Competence, Preparing Our Youth to Engage the World, have identified 4 skills that they believe globally competent students need to demonstrate. So the purple area, investigate the world beyond their immediate environment. Green area, recognise perspectives, others and their own. Blue area, communicate ideas effectively with diverse audiences. Orange, take action to improve conditions. The technology at our disposal, for example, global projects, allows us to move forward in each of these 4 areas. It's also interesting to note the changes in the ISTE standards for students over the last 2 decades. In 1998, students were learning to use technology. 2007, students were using technology to learn, and today, students should be engaged in transformative learning with technology, similar to what Grant was just talking about. On your New Zealand curriculum website, e-learning and pedagogy, it says, schools should explore not only how ICT can supplement traditional ways of teaching, but also how it can open up new and different ways of learning, which is the ISTE Transformative Learning with Technology stage for today's students. Now you know the theory, I invite you to put it into practice. Learn with the world and not just about the world, which is exactly what Bronwyn Joyce said this morning in a conversation as well. And you can do this by participating with your students in global projects. Could be with Flat Connections or with any equally well-designed global project. Google them, you will find quite a few. Think about it, look at your curriculum needs, then plan to make it happen. I've got some business cards here if you want some help. Otherwise, good luck with it all. Thank you. Oh, last one.
Connections are awesome. Wonderful to have you here for the second part of our 3-part conversation.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Gift here for you. Sorry, Grant, I can't get the gift through the screen to you. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm, your thoughts, and please join us for a conversation after the next sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sitting here in a hotel room somewhere north of Montreal. I'm not even sure. I landed in the dark and drove up. So, but privileged to be able to share a little bit on to contribute to this theme of going global. So I want to talk before I say anything. I just have to say that picture that you see is me and my very first grandchild, who is a week old now. I've done 6 presentations in the last week, and she's been in every presentation, and I think she's going to be in every presentation for the next 20 presentations or more. So that's all. It has nothing to do with the presentation, but I love that baby. So you get to see her there in all her glory. So there we are. All right, I want to talk about, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about how to be generous in a connected world. Again, kind of my context in all of this is a little bit important as I think about the role that I play in this idea of being connected. I was an elementary school teacher for 14 years, taught grades K to 8. I worked for a school district in Canada for about 9 years. For the past 6, I've been working as community manager for Discovery Education, where I've really been able to think very deeply about this idea of being connected. And I'm also on the board of directors of the EdCan Network, which is the largest Canadian body of association of educators across the country. So, and that's all in the last 29 years. So I'll give you the lessons up front that I've learned, and then we'll dive deep into these specifically. The one thing I've come to know very, very clearly that educators are kind and generous, to a fault even. Also that finding people takes some time and effort. It just doesn't come with a click of a button. It's not as easy as a lot of people would like to think it is. But you also guaranteed that by becoming connected in this way, you will become a better educator and probably more importantly, a better person. And that spaces change. We're going to talk a little bit about something called the tragedy of the commons, if you will, I guess, in how we have to sometimes protect spaces, but know that they naturally change and people move about. And finally, this is a really kind of a key point as well, is that there's communities and there's networks, and they're different, and we need both, but, and I'll leave the but as I kind of go through this in a little bit more detail. All right, so let's, for me, this began with this quote. There's a couple of quotes that I'm going to share with you, but this one in particular is one that caught my attention a while back, and it's from David Wiley, who is a big believer in open source resources. But he said, if there's no sharing, there's no teaching, which basically at its premise says that that's what teaching is. Teaching is the act of sharing. And so when you expand that idea beyond just what happens in a classroom, things become really interesting. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Ewan McIntosh, another really great friend of mine, who said that sharing, and he said sharing online specifically, is not in addition to the work, but it is the work of being an educator. And when I first read that quote, I wasn't sure I believed him. I wasn't sure I thought if that's true or not. The more I began to explore that idea, though, the more I did realize that, you know what, that is true. That's what we need to be doing all the time as educators, is thinking about how do we share beyond just our classroom, beyond just our school, in ways that are both relevant, but also just a natural part of what we do. So it was a few years later that I created this, and this is from 2010. I created a video called Sharing the Moral Imperative for the K-12 online conference. And it really was a great exercise for me in crystallizing my own thinking around what it means to share, what it means to be connected, and what are some lessons that we can learn. I want to share with you 3 ideas about this notion of sharing and how it all kind of relates to becoming, to being generous. And thinking about sharing as reflection, thinking about sharing as creativity, but also thinking about sharing as community. So let's start talking about sharing as reflection. There's no question that the tools of today make it ridiculously easy to share and ridiculously easy to be generous. And for me, the big step was 12 years ago when I started blogging. And that's where it began for me, very simply. Didn't really know what it was going to do. And for me, it was largely a new tool, and let's find out what happened. But it's become a really powerful place for me to share and reflect and think. And so often, I think one of the things that holds people back from doing this is that we really have not really understood what it means to publish. We still are embedded in some old ways of publishing, and what Clay Shirky talks about is, he says that publishing isn't evolving. He says it's going away. It used to mean this whole bunch of people who had to go through this really complex and expensive job of making something public. But he said it's not a job anymore. It's a button. There's a button, it says publish, and when you press it, it's done. And for me, that's always been revolutionary in the fact that I don't need anybody's permission to do this sharing. I don't need anybody to check my work. I just can publish and share, and it's incredibly empowering when you grasp that idea. And of course, the big shift has become, as Jay Rosen says, that the people formerly known as the audience. Now, we used to be the audience, and now again, that's been completely flipped around by our ability to share and reflect in these very, very powerful ways. And reflection sometimes isn't easy, and I really do value the fact that I can share not just things that I'm doing that I'm excited about or ideas that I have, but also the things that I'm not my best. And I ask this question: what is the value of being created in these public or open spaces? So that's a question that I would ponder throw your way. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this one is probably even the most important in my mind is sharing is community. What does community look like, and how does sharing sort of foster and build that notion of community? And I think we may have lost my connection. Is this true? Let me know when we're back, and if I should go back a few slides. Pardon? Should I go back, or where am I going here?
Yeah, it'd be great if you went back a little. Is that okay, Dean, please?
Sure, tell me when to stop.
He was talking about publishing.
Keep going back.
Keep going back?
Yep. There we go.
Right there?
One slide forward, Grant, and then unfortunately the internet went out right across here. So next slide.
Okay, so should I just pick it up from here?
Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. That's it. Pick it up from here. Thank you so much.
All right. I said something really brilliant while I was off, by the way, and I don't know if I can get it back. So I'll do my best. And this is what I was talking about. I was suggesting the fact that reflection isn't simply about sharing all the things that we're doing, but this idea really about being vulnerable and sharing the fact that sometimes we need to share the things that don't go well, and that's been a really powerful thing for me, because those are the times that I demonstrate to my colleagues as well that I have a lot of learning to do. And again, by doing this in a public space, I often am privileged to get some tremendous feedback from other people to say, well, here's some things you could try next time. And I realize that for a lot of people, that's extremely challenging to become that vulnerable. But it's just, I've had untold benefits from being able to do that, beyond the fact that by doing that, that has built further relationships. I think about, again, so many people, Anne and others that I've been able to connect with in these ways. But the picture on the right is always one that I'm reminded of, because this is somebody, you talk about being vulnerable. He shared his classroom through a live stream that ran 24 hours a day for a whole year. His classroom, you could log in and watch his classroom at any time. The interesting thing about William is I've still yet to meet him. I've connected with him, and I connect with him almost every day. I'll share later in another space, but yet I've never met him. But his ability to be reflective and share through that medium is very, very powerful. So the question I leave you with, and again, we'll have maybe time at the end to talk about this, is what does reflection look like for you? Beyond just, and is it something that's just a personal thing that I just do myself and I think about, or is there a way to do this in a more open, share in a way that really can create some generosity and sharing? The second idea I want to share quickly is about sharing as creativity. And for me, this begins with using lots of tools that perhaps I wouldn't use before, but the spaces that we have today can foster some really interesting learning. And I got to tell you, I never thought of myself as a creative person, but technology has really changed that for me. So I'm the kind of person that if there's an app that can clone myself, I'm going to try it, right? What's not better than more of me, I guess. I don't know. And it's just, again, these are silly things, but this silliness and this playfulness and this creativity can lead to some other things. And I've been fortunate to be able to learn a lot of skills through that playfulness. And I've created some, what I think are pretty compelling, rich stories of people, profiles of different educators. And I've learned a lot through that sharing, and I've been able to be creative through that. And as well, you can see on the right-hand side here, this was a collaborative video that I created with about 70 people around the world for a dedication for a birthday for a colleague of mine. But that ability to try those things and do those things in public and share is something I can't express how valuable that's to be in my own growth. And this particular chart is something I share in virtually every presentation that I do, because I think it really speaks to the idea of the gap here between doing nothing and something is far greater than the gap between something and something excellent. And it's that idea that if you try something, you have the potential to do something really, really well. And I think, again, if there's anything that technology does for us, it is the ability for us to try and experiment and explore. So the question again around this topic is, what's the value of being created in these open and public spaces? So the last thing I want to share with you, which is really kind of at the heart of why I think sharing is such a big deal, is sharing is community. And it's important, I think, to distinguish between the idea of networks and communities. And this is one that I'm not convinced that I have a completely pure definition, and I don't think they are separate. There's a lot that overlap, but I do think there's some distinguishing factors. So a good conversation starter to have is, what's the difference between networks and communities? And I would define networks as being this weak ties in one respect. These are ties that I don't have a strong obligation to people. There's thousands and thousands of people that fall into that network. They might not even know who I am, but they're part of my network, and I learn from them, and I'm with them. And it's very, very important to have. But it's also important to recognize where they sort of fit in this idea. And so one of the things that's I'm just going to kind of keep going here a little bit further. But thinking of the shift, and this is part of wrapping our heads around when you start introducing this idea of being connected. I love this graphic that says in 1998, you tell people don't get into strangers' cars and don't meet people from the internet. And in 2016, you literally summon strangers from the internet to get in their car. It's quite a different world, but still this idea of networks is kind of interesting. Where this sort of starts to shift for me is in the way that we connect with people. And I like telling this story because it's example, again, of the blurring of the idea of networks and communities. So a couple years ago, it was my birthday, and I was away traveling. And my wife kept sending me photos of, I'm wondering if I'm lost here. Am I still going?
Yeah, you're still here.
Okay, great. I'm looking at my YouTube screen here, and I see Grant on YouTube, so that's why I'm a little confused, but that's okay. So my birthday came, and my wife sent photos, said all these packages are coming to you. And I came home and opened up these packages, and there were 86 pairs of socks from people all over the world who were part of my network and had connected with me in some way. And then some of them left me a note. And some of these people that I knew extremely well, others were people that I'd never met before. And it just struck me what a powerful thing this is. And a lot of this sort of stems from the way in which I've decided to interact with other people online. And I love this quote by Howard Rheingold that said that idle chatter can be the social glue from which networks of trust and norms of reciprocity and potential social capital can emerge. And so if people do follow me on Twitter, for example, I tend not always to be the most serious. I talk about a lot of wide range of things, but part of that is intentional in the way in which I want to connect with people. And I want to create some bond beyond just sort of talking about your most, your favorite links and other kind of questions around education, because I think this is more about the human experience. And so my Twitter, it's interesting how my Twitter has changed. I just pulled up the other day some of my stats from before, and you can see, if you just look at the month of September from 2011 to 2017. The difference in the number of times I've tweeted. And that's because those spaces change over time. And they still are a great places to build networks. But for me, that they used to be a place of community, and I don't find that anymore. I don't find those kind of deeper connections. And I think part of it is the world around us is changing in the way, and these are some of sort of the downsides, if you will, of this sort of network living. I think we've shifted away, and I'm not sure that it used to be as equal anymore. I think there's much more of a gaming of the system to try to get followers and try to expand your networks as if it's some sort of a game. Whereas I don't know that I originally thought of it in that way. It was just there was a democratization of the web, and I'm not sure that that's staying. So that's why I'm questioning the equality of it. I'm also really challenged by this notion of branding, which has really become popular in a lot of education circles. I don't like the idea of people as brands. I think people are human beings, and branding to me has a lot of negative connotations that take away from that human experience. And so for me, the shifting of these spaces, if you know anything about the tragedy of commons, that's the idea that these spaces over time erode if we're not careful with them. So for me, communities are built in other places. Like Voxer's a place now where I connect with people around common interests. I have people that I just talk about sports with. I have people that I talk about podcasts with. My own family is a great place where we use a tool like Snapchat. Snapchat is a much more personal kind of space. I'm very, very careful with the people that I follow, and I want to follow people that are, that I have a relationship with. Same with Instagram. Instagram is another kind of shifting place where I'm trying to build more of the idea of community. So not just a massive number of people that I connect with, people that I really might want to have, that I feel like I have some sort of a commitment and a relationship to that more constitutes community. One of my great heroes around this idea of communities is Dr. Rick Schweer, who talks about the elements of community. And this is sort of the distinguishing thing between networks and community, that they have these characteristics, this idea of participation and autonomy and integration. And I love this idea of history too, the fact that people have stories they talk about, things that they reminisce about, and that there's some identity that everybody identifies, and that there's a future, that there's a plan for what we're going to do next and what we hope to do. And all of this kind of built around a really important idea that's trust. And I don't know that networks have that same level of trust, but certainly communities do. So my role today is building community. And so I get to work with teachers all around the world. Primarily my work is in Canada, but really extends beyond that. And it's really the idea of our tagline is connecting educators to their most valuable resource, which is each other. So I think about that idea of, and that's the question I leave you with, is how have communities fostered your own learning? So I don't know if I'm over time, under time, but I'm done now. And I thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the chance to share a little bit with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hanging with us. We lost the internet completely there, so we're beaming you in out of my phone, hotspotting, connecting, making it work. We've definitely got time for a bit of a chat and a bit of a conversation and questions. So we're going to bring Dean and Grant. We've got Grant in? Sure we can. Where's my laptop? Yeah, for sure. So do you want to hold it? Has anyone got questions? Start the ball rolling while I bring Grant into this conversation. Come on, someone must have someone. Anybody? Anything? What are you thinking? What are you wondering?
The first thing that scares you is technology. I mean, you've got a technician by your side, which is wonderful, but when you haven't got that technology capability within your school that's reliable, it is off-putting, and that is kind of a reality. So we need to start simple somehow, I guess.
Yep.
How did you get everyone to send socks to you?
Can you hear us all right there? Oh, hang on.
I didn't hear the question. Sorry, I just heard people laughing, which I assume they're laughing at me, which I get all the time. But
I think it was how did you get socks? How did you get people to send socks to you?
what was it about the socks?
Yes, yeah. How did you get them to send them to you? I think that's a question from the floor.
So again, I apologize. I know it's about the socks. How did I get them? I have like a big laundry basket full of socks, and I'm good for socks for the rest of my life. There's socks I haven't even worn yet, but I'm good for a long time.
Zoom link, and then hopefully we'll have all three in the room. And just as an interesting segue For me, it's really interesting. Grant was here a couple of years ago at uLearn. Christine's here at uLearn 17, face-to-face, and you're here virtually and hopefully very soon at uLearn somewhere in the near future. Fingers crossed. So a pleasure and a privilege to bring a truly blended experience to the room from around the world. Awesome opportunity. Questions, I can see they're all bubbling away. Who's got a wondering? They're a very quiet group, Dean. Here we go. Here's Grant coming in. Kia ora, Grant. Welcome back in.
Can you hear us, Grant?
Christine?
Yeah, sure can.
Your response. We've got the three.
Yep.
Have you got a question? Fantastic.
Hi, Dean. It's Chris here. At the start of your talk, you were talking about there was no learning. Sorry, I'm going to get it wrong now. With the teaching, there was no learning happening unless you were sharing. Yeah? Our speaker this morning was also talking along a similar vein, talking about there was no learning by the students without sharing. So you would obviously agree it goes both ways?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing. If Anne, I don't know if you can type the question in or.
Yeah, I think if you just come up close to the computer and just use the computer microphone. There you go.
I am. Can you hear me, Dan?
That's better. Yes, thank you.
At the start of your talk today, you were saying about teaching. There's no teaching without sharing. Our keynote speaker this morning was saying there was no learning by students without that sharing. So would you agree it works both ways? The learning only happens by everyone sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the reason that statement specifically resonated because I felt at the time there was a lot of hesitancy. I was at, probably, again, going back 10 years ago, I was experiencing such a revolution in my own learning because other people were sharing online. And I was connected to them. And I thought, something's missing here. And there's no difference between this and the classroom. Something's different. Like, why should I benefit from all of these other people sharing, but I'm not making any contribution? And so when I teach online, and I teach master's level class, and my students have to answer two questions. And I would argue, I don't care if you teach kindergarten or graduate courses. These two questions I think are fundamental to the idea of community learning. One, what did you learn from others in this course, in this class? And number two, what did you contribute to their learning? I think if you don't get those two classroom experience, you're in some ways saying it doesn't matter that other people are here. You could just be by yourself and learn, by watching a YouTube video. And the reality is that even a YouTube video, somebody created that. And so at some point, thinking about it as educators, we have this moral obligation that we should be giving back something to someone. And why wouldn't we teach that at the classroom level, that everybody should be making some kind of contribution? Otherwise, there's no point in gathering together, in whether it's face-to-face or virtually. You might as well just learn on your own.
I just want to acknowledge and thank you all. The chance of us connecting, sharing the story, telling a connected learning conversation, having this live stream being done across the world, truly global, generous, connected conversations. Kia ora, araha, gratitude, namahi.